Hearthstone is tricky. Current sentiment towards the game isn't exactly positive, but then again, card game conjecture generally isn't very positive, so I digress. But when Hearthstone came out, it was absolutely massive. Nobody had traversed into the digital card game market before and came out so far ahead. And for as much as Blizzard is stumbling today, and boy are they stumbling, I don't think they just got lucky from their initial foray. They used to be phenomenal innovators. Since the release of Hearthstone, no new digital card game has even come close to its prime. So let's examine the medium that the genre is expressed through. Let's explore the innovations of the digital card game. When creating a card game solely for digital, you're forced to make some concessions right off the bat. You're not selling physical cards, so collectability is a much smaller factor. You won't be able to entice new players with shiny cards that can go for big bucks if you manage to open it. You also don't have the sense of community that comes with players being forced to meet face to face to play the game. This second part is a bit of a stretch, but it is a small thing that digital games just don't have. Just remember that these drawbacks definitely apply to Hearthstone. The simplest, most important benefit of a digital card game is in the quality of life. Simply put, digital card games help strip away all the setup and all the non-gameplay actions that keep players from actually playing the game. Things like shuffling your deck before you start, going into your deck to search cards, shuffling after searching, are all things that the game can do for you. In a digital card game, the downtime and busy work from all of these are eliminated. Sure, you'll still have to wait for your opponent to choose the right card, but the games will for sure go faster. Hearthstone has many cards that are able to read "draw a blank," that if translated to paper would have to be written as "search your deck and add a blank to your hand." The cards would functionally be the same, but the gameplay experience would be slower. Elaborating on quality of life, the game can keep track of just about everything for you. If you watch a Magic tournament, all the players are keeping track of the life count on a notepad. When everything is digital, you don't have to do that. Not only that, cards will tell you on their own if a requirement for them is met. If you don't have the mana to play a card in Hearthstone, it tells you. And if a card has a condition that is met, then it will light up yellow. You don't need to do any of the checking, the game will do it for you. The final thing I want to bring up is that the game more or less eliminates human mistakes. While you can still definitely misclick, you can't drop your cards, or tell your opponent misinformation, or all the mistakes that aren't a part of the game both of you sat down to play. This is a small part, but eliminating it is just good for everyone. We don't want to have to ban people for lying, right? So, surprise surprise, putting a game online makes the quality of life better. Not something that would be unexpected. So let's go into card design and the game design that Hearthstone decided to push. But before I start going into these, I want everyone to keep this thought in the back of your minds. All these design decisions are possible in a paper game. Mostly. It's just that the digital media allows for the interesting mechanics to be implemented while not trampling over the convenience of the player. Everything can be ported to paper, it just hasn't for a good reason. Let's start off from the beginning and work towards the things that were released later. To begin, we have the hero power. Every single class has a unique hero power that can be activated for 2 mana, eventually one with 1 mana, and it refreshes every turn, so you always have something to do. Whether it be damage, a body, healing, or a weapon, Hearthstone makes sure that after turn 1, you always have the choice to do something. And these different hero powers help give classes in Hearthstone their identities. This wouldn't be hard to implement in a game like Magic. Every color has a specific power that untaps like everything else, is untargetable like an emblem, and can tap to do something for 2 mana. And this hero power is another game mechanic that can be designed around. Things like upgrading it, refreshing it, changing it with hero cards. The hero power opens up a whole new avenue of design that cards don't allow for. Similar to how Magic can play around with the 1 land drop per turn, Hearthstone can play around with the hero power, a resource that you never lose access to. As long as you make it weak, it can open up a world of possibilities. Next we get to my favorite change that Hearthstone has made. In card games, there are usually 2 universal win conditions. You lower your opponent's life to 0, or the equivalent of it, or your opponent is unable to draw a card for turn. They deck out. Now, most of the time, games don't come down to this. The first condition is usually met, or an alternative win condition is fulfilled before one person runs out of cards. So while strategies and cards can be built around this playstyle, it isn't very common. So how does Hearthstone approach this win condition? Unlike most other card games, Hearthstone released with a relatively small deck size, only a deck size of 30. And unlike games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Hearthstone games are actually meant to go a bit longer. So with a slower game and a smaller deck, decking out seems less like a fringe way to keep games from going forever, and more like an inevitability. But in Hearthstone, when you run out of cards, you don't instantly lose. You start taking fatigue damage. For every card that you draw when you've decked out, you take fatigue damage, with every further card drawn dealing more and more damage. I love this. I think this is absolutely brilliant. Not only are you still punished for burning through your deck really fast, it also doesn't end the game on the spot. It's still an important part of late games. Decks that want to go long have to have ways of preventing the scaling fatigue damage, but it doesn't feel nearly as bad to lose to. And eventually, the Hearthstone team even designed cards and mechanics around having an empty deck and how deep in fatigue you were in. An alternative to the industry standard became an entirely new mechanic that could be designed around. Does fatigue make people not hate playing against mill decks? No, not at all. You can even consider it worse because milling cards bypasses the graveyard mechanic in the game, but it is interesting, and in this case, wonderfully executed. I talked about checks earlier, but Hearthstone allows cards to be printed that have checks of non-public information. What do I mean by this? Here is a card, Reno Jackson, that has an effect that only goes off if your deck has no duplicates. An effect if printed in paper will require a deck list check along with a hand check. But in Hearthstone, the game just knows if you have no dupes. And that's that. And this isn't the only example. Hearthstone has cards that activate if you only have a certain number of cards in your deck, if your deck only contains a certain type of card, and even more cards that require no duplicates. Normally, these mechanics would mean extra checking and investigating, but they work seamlessly in Hearthstone. In order for card games to be able to save room on text, common text can be shortened to a keyword, something like this. Haste means that a creature doesn't have summoning sickness, but haste is one word as opposed to a sentence. This lets designers save space by just printing the keyword without the explanation. And if there is room on the card, they can do the best of both worlds and print both the keyword and the explanation for the keyword. But here comes the disadvantages of something like this. Let's say a new player stumbles upon a card like this. There wasn't room to explain the keywords. Someone brand new to the game will have no idea what any of this means. Now, this isn't that big a deal in the modern era, you could just look it up. But it is something that could definitely dissuade newer players. You could also avoid this altogether by going the Yu-Gi-Oh route and never making any keywords and just putting all the text on the card. But that presents its own problem. Card game players already hate reading. It is what it is. But when presented with such a wall of text, it further dissuades the people who probably weren't going to read it to begin with. Once again, you can use the medium to your advantage. In Hearthstone, there are still keywords, but none of the cards have anything to explain the keywords, unless you hover over them. This way, they can print a card like this, which is just all keywords. And a new player only needs to take a moment to understand it, while keeping all of the positives that keywords have for current and legacy players. Speaking of keywords, in Magic there are many cards that create other cards, which usually are represented by tokens, game pieces that don't exist in the deck lists. Creatures or sorceries that create additional creatures, cards that make clues, treasures, and maybe even blood. And these cards aren't uncommon. For an example, these are the tokens I have for my commander deck. I won't say that requiring all of these is a bad thing, or even mandatory, because you can just use whatever to represent the tokens, but it does limit the printing of complex tokens a bit. Sure, tokens like Merit Lage exist, but tokens only really go as far as keywords. But because the client generates all the cards, it also generates all the tokens. so token generation can be pushed without any regard for convenience. Not only that, more complex tokens can also be designed for. You don't have to worry about forgetting what a token like this does. Print all the tokens you want and make them as wild as you want. We're getting there, don't worry. Next up is effects triggering in non-traditional places. In just about every paper card game, there are no effects or checks that occur when the card is still in your deck. Could this mechanic be implemented? Maybe, but it would be messy and slow and be a whole thing. Here comes Hearthstone with a very unique card, Patches the Pirate. Play a pirate, and this guy comes flying out of your deck. Now this type of card design didn't reappear because it was impossible to balance, but the idea in isolation is still really cool, and can only really be done digitally. The same can be said with in-hand and in-deck buffs. Most effects that change attack power and health are only done to cards that are on the field, because it ends up being impossible to track if it also affects things outside of readily available and tracked public information. Global effects need to have a physical piece to represent them, which is why lingering effects come in the form of cards or emblems, or a flipped over counter in this specific case. But too many things and tokens and emblems can be overwhelming, and the game tracking it means less hassle all around. Less things for the player to track means more opportunity for the designers to play around. Almost there, I'll get to my point soon. Hearthstone has a mechanic that is unique to it that is a bit contentious. The keyword Discover. Generate 3 cards and select one of them, generally to add to your hand. The point is, Hearthstone generates cards, not just tokens, not just counters. The digital format allows cards not put in your deck to affect the outcome of the game. This can add more variance into the game depending on the pool which cards can come out of, which is what makes the mechanic contentious. Personally, I like it, but I can understand why others wouldn't. The digital landscape can handle randomness much better than a paper one, which lends its way to many more cards that randomly target, cast random spells, or choose random effects. And in a genre built on variance, a digital Hearthstone introduces new exciting flavors of it. The point is, something like Discover can only really exist in a digital space, and is another example of Hearthstone using the unique medium to innovate. Randomness is contentious, but new ways of exploring randomness can be fun and interesting. The last thing doesn't neatly fit into a point, so I'll just call it cool things that Hearthstone has done. A card like Zephyrus, where an algorithm selects the best card out of a large pool for you to pick. Kill Jaden, which turns your deck into an endless pile of demons. Secrets that trigger without player initiative. Quests, which track your progress of certain actions and give you unique powerful rewards when completed. Deck of Chaos, swapping the cost and attack of cards in your deck. Deck of Lunacy, which transforms your spells into spells of higher cost while keeping their original cost. Cards that reorder your entire deck, and something like Yogg-Saron just casting random spells. So many wacky, cool effects that any other card game wouldn't dream of implementing. And Hearthstone exemplifies the creativity and fun that can be had in card design, which is why I think the game has inspired the community to make custom Hearthstone cards such a big thing. So I've made it this far, but I really haven't said anything. So let me make my piece. Hearthstone has all these cool card designs and ideas, but like I said earlier, if you really think about it, all, and I mean all of these cards, could be implemented into a paper game. But they aren't because of the one reason I pointed out: player convenience. If you wanted to run a card with Discover, you'd have to carry around the entire pool, and shuffle every time you needed to discover something. If you play a card like Polkelt, your opponent would have to wait while you slowly reorder every single card in your deck. Everyone would need to carry an additional deck box just for all the potential cards that need to be generated. Everyone brings a hero power counter, a fatigue counter, and everyone writes down everything. Every single enter the battlefield trigger, every single death rattle, and every action that occurred during each turn. It can be done, but no rational person would want their players to have to do this. The designers of Hearthstone are not the most creative or the smartest people to ever touch a card game. They just understood how they could use their medium to their advantage, and implement all these designs that could never be part of a paper game. Hearthstone takes out all the additional work associated with a paper card game, and leaves in all the fun creative concepts that all the talented people behind the game bring. This is all I have to say. For everyone developing a digital card game, please go crazy, experiment, go absolutely wild with the mechanics you can employ. Take advantage of the medium to the greatest, because if the game can be seamlessly ported over to paper, I think you've done something wrong, or at least not lived up to the potential you innately have. Innovate, come up with new mechanics, and not only will the digital card game genre grow due to it, but the card game genre will be better as a whole.